When the Colonial Dames bought the Jimenez Facio house in 1939, they knew they had something special, but they weren't really sure, and they came up with a lot of ideas of their own ways to interpret it. And they started thinking, we need to research this very thoroughly. And so they decided to bring in Charles Peterson. He was one of the foremost historic preservation architects in America at the time. And so they were able to obtain a grant from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and they brought Mr. Peterson in to study the different architectural elements in the house, and he was amazed. He almost immediately could tell it had been some sort of boarding house from his studies. Charlie Peterson knew William Seal, and he recommended that we bring him in. And he was the historian that encouraged the Dames to find primary sources, such as wills and tax deeds, to learn more about this house. At that point, he sent them to do their homework, and for about a year they did study through many primary sources, such as newspapers, tax assessments, wills, marriage certificates, so they could find out who the people were that were in town as far as the tourists coming in, as well as the women that had owned the house, and they could find out more about their lives through these documents. They could also find out about the items that were in the house. Along with the historians and the architects, they brought the best archaeologists in Florida here through the University of Florida, Florida State, to do these excavations. And they found all kinds of artifacts that could help us learn more about the people who were staying and living here at the time. They brought in two of the best bioarchaeologists, and they discovered the bones of the animals they were eating, the seeds in the ground, and the plant remains. They are able to analyze these plant remains and find out what the guests were eating. The interpretation had been decided on, and now we needed to procure the artifacts and furniture and items that would portray the lifestyles of the visitors here. So the Colonial Dames actually had a list that William Seal had drawn up of items that would be used to furnish the house in this time period. And so, armed with this list, the Colonial Dames went shopping. They went to the many different antique stores, mostly in North Florida and South Georgia. They would go to auctions and estate sales. Their cardinal rule was it must be of the early to mid-19th century. It would have had to have been something that would have been in St. Augustine during that time period. It took about a decade to find everything. The first item purchased for the house was an astral lamp, and this was a very unique new kind of lamp during that particular time period. It was to be placed on a center table, and it had a round wick so it didn't cast a shadow, and it was like the heart of the room where everybody would gather around. They needed to set the table in the dining room, and they needed to figure out what china patterns they were going to use, and this is where the archaeology came in. They had found bits and pieces of predominantly blue and green feather-edged pottery, and so they scoured the antique shops and were able to buy these plates and were able to set the table with those patterns. The Colonial Dames were very fortunate because they were able to get the soup tureen that Sarah Petty Anderson, one of the owners of this house, had actually had on the table during the time period, and descendants of hers lent us her soup tureen. The way people arranged furniture in their rooms in those days were very different from today. For instance, they would have a round table in the center of the room for conversation. That was where the light would be. We heavily relied on William Seal being the historian. He studied these things about where things were placed in people's homes, descriptions of the rooms. And as the years went on, he became more and more convinced about how important this historic property was. This is a house museum in contrast to like an art museum or a history museum. Both tell stories in a different way, but the house museum in particular tells a story of a snapshot in time, of a specific time period about the people who lived there and the things they did. Authenticity was always the motivation for the colonial dames to interpret this house museum correctly and in a way that would relate to the public and the stories we tell them.